Thank you, Karen DeVore. It's an honor to be in your presence. It is also wonderful to be here looking at so many friends and having all kinds of flashbacks. And speaking of flashbacks, I was telling my dad, who's 84, that I was speaking here this morning, and he reminded me that this is his alma mater in a weird way. He enrolled here, paid his first semester's tuition. His dream was to become a prosecutor, and then he was drafted. And his draft board would not let him out, and so he never came back, never got to be a graduate of Fordham Law School. But the good news is you gave him his money back, so thank you so much for that. What I want to do this morning is share with you some thoughts on my perspective, both as someone returning to government when I became FBI director in September of 2013 after 8 years away, and then as someone who has had the good fortune to be FBI director now for a year and 2 months. And then the best part for me will be to take your questions. So I stand here with only 8 years and 10 months left in this job. And I don't mean to express it like someone who's incarcerated. I mean that because I believe I have the best job in the entire world. And so I quietly grieve as each month ticks off. But what I've tried to do with those first year and 2 months is travel around and see my troops, because the FBI is a deployed organization, as often as I possibly can to ask them about the FBI's priorities. And a key part of those visits has been in each of the 51 field offices I have visited, and I will hit all of my 56 field offices before the end of this year. In each of those visits, a key session has been sitting down with our state and local partners to ask them how it's going, what's working well, what are you worried about, what should I be worried about. So let me offer you my perspective after that year, and especially after 8 years away from government, because when I returned, I found that we faced very serious threats you're going to spend time today talking about, but in at least 2 ways that surprised me as a returnee after 8 years in the private sector, where my knowledge of what was going on in the counterterrorism world was confined to what I read in the newspaper, and frankly didn't pay nearly the kind of attention that maybe I should have during that time. But there's no doubt I had an outsider's perspective. So there are 2 ways in which I saw the threat changing. I saw that we had made tremendous progress since 9/11 in taking the fight to the core al-Qaeda tumor, is the way I think of it, along the AfPak border. And we had taken the fight there, and in the course of doing that, significantly shrunk that tumor, made great progress there in denying them safe haven, denying them communications, and in removing their leadership. But at the same time, the progeny of al-Qaeda had become a metastasis off of that central tumor, and that we had seen popping up in the lightly governed and ungoverned spaces in the Gulf, the Mediterranean, North Africa, these progeny of al-Qaeda, and they'd begun to flourish. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and especially in the safe haven offered in Syria, and then increasingly into Iraq, al-Nusra Front, an al-Qaeda progeny, ISIL, the group that the media often refers to as ISIS, that we call ISIL, and different parts of those groups and associated groups, one you've read about in recent weeks called the Khorasan Group, an al-Qaeda progeny centered in the safe haven of Syria. And what we saw was, especially in the wake of the Arab Spring, this growth in ungoverned or lightly governed spaces had allowed these metastases to take root and to flourish, and to do 2 things: themselves to engage in activities in their safe haven and planning to take action outside their safe haven. But more than that, they're working to attract to their safe havens new recruits, people who would come, learn from them, form relationships with them. The so-called traveler phenomenon blossomed in the last 4 or 5 years. The going to those places is very worrisome, obviously, because the people will gain relationships and training and cross some of the invisible lines in human experience, the most significant being killing another person. The going worries us very much. The coming worries us perhaps more, because all of us in the counterterrorism business can remember terrorist diaspora after the war with the Soviets in Afghanistan, and can trace a line from that diaspora to the events of 9/11. And we are determined not to allow a future terrorist diaspora, especially out of Syria, to connect to future tragedies. We have a reasonably good handle on those who have traveled to a place like Syria and traveled back. We have, though, enough humility to constantly ask ourselves, what are we missing? Who might we be missing who is looking to travel or who has traveled? And the challenge is obvious. In this great, big, wonderful, free country of ours, there are literally thousands of ways to get from the United States to Syria and the same number of ways to return. And we have tens of thousands of Americans traveling for all manner of good and legitimate reasons out of this country in the direction of Syria every single day. And so finding among that group those who are responding to the call, especially of a group like ISIL, is extremely difficult. And it's something we spend every single day working on. And I mentioned the call of ISIL. One thing that has struck me returning to government and coming to know this group is that their propaganda is unusually slick. They're broadcasting their poison in something like 23 languages. Very, very well done, very clever, pushed out through all manner of social media. That explosion of terrorist propaganda seems to have two obvious aims. One is to raise their brand, to increase their identity in the global jihad, and the second is to attract to them both fighters and increasingly people who would be the spouses of fighters, so that they can create families in their caliphate, so-called. They can begin to put down roots and attract families to their warped world. Just last month, we intercepted 3 Denver schoolgirls who were on their way to Turkey with the intention of going to Syria to be joined with the family of ISIL. We were fortunate to have gotten tipped off by their families and have stopped them in Germany and turned them around. But as an FBI director, obviously that's alarming. As a father, I find that shocking and horrifying. But it is part of the phenomenon that we're grappling with right now. So the first way in which the world has changed since I was away is this proliferation of the progeny of al-Qaeda thriving in the safe havens, especially in Syria, increasingly into Iraq. That's the first way. The second way, the sheer volume of terrorist propaganda available on the internet and the proliferation of communication on the internet is a big change since I left government in 2005 and has given rise to the phenomenon we call homegrown violent extremists. Some call them lone wolves. That's a term I don't like because I think it conveys a sense of dignity that is not deserved. These HVEs, as we call them, are people who may never meet a member of al-Qaeda or al-Nusra Front or AQAP, but will instead be radicalized by their propaganda, equipped to engage in their jihad without ever actually leaving their basement or their bedroom. They can get all they need on the internet to engage in an act of violence here in the United States as part of some effort to find meaning in their own lives by engaging in jihad. The explosion of that phenomenon is something that is very new to me since 2005, one that we saw in a very real way recently in Canada with the tragedy at the War Memorial and the shooting inside their parliament. These are folks who are responding to the exhortation of ISIL, just kill somebody in our name. And if you can video it, all the better, so that we can get our message out. And this itself is a big change since 2005, when in a way, we banked on the core al-Qaeda culture being one in which it needed to be big. Right? That if they just engaged core al-Qaeda in a random act of violence, in some ways it would be a confession of loss, of failure, because they had been degraded. Today, it's simply killing. If someone can be killed in the name of ISIL and credit gained, their vision of global jihad and taking the fight to the great Satan, especially the United States, will have been achieved. So in those two respects, the metastasis and the explosion of both propaganda and training on the internet, the threat today is very different than when I left it in 2005, and in some ways more worrisome because it is more difficult to track. I've explained everywhere I've been in the country that the homegrown violent extremism problem is not a New York problem, it's not a Washington problem or an LA problem. It's a problem wherever there are troubled souls with access to the internet, and that is everywhere in this great country of ours. So, what are we doing about it? One of the things we are trying to continue to do better is focus on how we gather and share intelligence. One of the things I've learned over the last 1 year and 2 months of the FBI is that my predecessor, Bob Mueller, began and achieved a tremendous transformation in the FBI to drive us since 9/11 to be more thoughtful about what do we know, what don't we know, and how do we go about closing the gap between those two things, and who needs to know what we know. I describe the FBI in a single sentence. We are a national security and law enforcement organization that uses, collects, and shares intelligence in everything that we do. The FBI, I believe, has always been in the intelligence business. Intelligence is information relevant to decision making. It's always been the FBI's business. We have always been extremely good at finding stuff out, right? Talking to people and finding stuff out. What we have gotten increasingly good at since 9/11, and I am continuing to push, is asking ourselves, so what stuff do we know, what stuff don't we know, and who needs to know what we know? Right? I said we use, collect, and share intelligence in everything that we do, and focusing on that sharing for maximum benefit within the U.S. government and with our partners in state and local law enforcement is one of the critical parts of the FBI being effective, especially in the counterterrorism area. And doing it with careful remembering that the spine of the FBI, the core of the FBI, is our commitment to the rule of law, to doing it in the right way, in a way that whenever possible we can explain to folks, defend, and offer transparency into. We are making changes inside the FBI in my year and 2 months to try and make sure that this intelligence transformation gets better, gets faster, and gets deeper in the organization. I insist that we become more thoughtful about what we need to know and what we know in every part of the organization, not just counterterrorism and counterintelligence, but criminal, cyber, our international operations, our recruiting, our training, our security, our human resources. Every part of the FBI needs to be asking itself, so what do we know, what don't we know, and how do we close the gap between those things? We call this being threat-based and intelligence-driven. My predecessor, again, the great Bob Mueller, began a process where once a year the FBI as an organization sits down and says, what are all the bad things that could happen in this great country of ours that the FBI might be able to do something about? The FBI might be able to contribute to reducing those threats. And believe it or not, there are more than 300 bad things that could happen in the United States that the FBI, we believe, could contribute to doing something about. And then we sit down at a national level and say, okay, given the threat, the magnitude of the threat, given what's being done by others to try and reduce that threat, what should be our highest priorities? How would we rank them? And then we engage in that same exercise in each of our 56 field offices. What are the bad things that could happen in New York or Seattle or Miami or El Paso, Texas? Who's doing something to try and reduce those? And given that, what might we do? And what should be our priorities here in El Paso or in New York? And then we mash the two together to make sure that the national threat picture and the local threat picture are blended together to come up with a priority list. It will not surprise you that we have continued to have counterterrorism at the top of our list. That makes very good sense to me for some of the reasons that we've talked about. But this exercise forces us to be thoughtful about what we know, who else is doing something about the threats, come to understand the work that our partners are doing, and therefore what should we work on. We have gotten tremendously better at doing this. We need to get better still, in my view. The reason it's so important that I talk to our partners when I travel around the country, and the reason that this threat review and prioritization process, the name for our process of trying to figure out what we should focus on, involves our partners, is that there's simply nothing that the FBI does alone. Not an overstatement. Simply nothing that we do in trying to reduce the threats that we address that we do without partners. I spoke last week in Orlando to the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the IACP. And one of the reasons I was there to try and underscore just what I said, the things the FBI tries to accomplish depend in a huge way on our relationship with state and local law enforcement, and especially when it comes to terrorism. Our joint terrorism task forces are at the core of our effort to try and protect this country. And as we sit here in New York City, the home of the great New York City Police Department, I don't need to remind you of that. The NYPD is a partner in our national effort to protect this country, must remain so, and our relationship with the NYPD remains one of the most important we have in this entire nation. The changing threat landscape, the one that I've talked about that involves the proliferation of threats overseas, the traveler phenomenon, and the homegrown violent extremist phenomenon, all present threats that are unlikely to be seen first by a federal agent. right? The traveler who is looking to go to Syria to fight, or who has just come back, or the troubled soul who is radicalizing him or herself on the internet, is most likely going to be noticed first by somebody saying something to a deputy sheriff or an officer on patrol. Those links, our links to those folks, have to be at the center of our counterterrorism effort, or we're going to miss things. I grew up in New York City as a law enforcement officer, where there were occasionally, back in the old days, some turf disputes. I know those don't exist anymore, but I thought I would say a word about that. I have no patience for turf battles. I think the American people have no patience for turf battles, can't possibly understand why organizations would fight with each other. Whenever I travel around the country and any of my folks say, well, someone is doing work that we, the FBI, should be doing, my response is the same. That reminds me, I was not a football player, but I'll use a football metaphor. That reminds me of someone saying, hey, the quarterback's not throwing to me. Why is the quarterback throwing to the other receiver? And my answer is, run great routes, get open. Every time you touch the ball, score. The quarterback will throw you the ball. Right? Be great. Be excellent. Nothing succeeds like excellence. Wasting time arguing over whose work this should be, whose credit that should be, is getting in the way of your being excellent. Just go be excellent. I like competition. Right? I used to think that when I was U.S. Attorney in Manhattan that we ought to only have one judicial district in the city of New York, and that it was bad that those evil people across the Brooklyn Bridge were stealing all of my cases. When I became Deputy Attorney General and had a little more mature view, I came to realize there was great benefit for the American people in having two great U.S. Attorney's offices in the city of New York competing with each other. I think I am better in so many ways because I competed with my siblings. Right? I played so many games with my brothers, learned so much from my brothers. The relationship between and among agencies should be like that. We should compete with each other. That makes us better. That's in the taxpayer's interest. But I would wrestle on the floor with my brothers and get up loving each other. There were no butcher knives chasing each other around the kitchen, but that's when competition becomes dysfunction. Turf battles get in the way of our ability to do our work. I've talked about this throughout my agency around the country. I believe the best relationships are those like my siblings. We love each other, we each want to be great, and we learn to work together. Because, as I said, without those eyes and ears and those relationships, none of us are able to be as effective as we need to be. I should say we also depend in the counterterrorism world to a great extent on the eyes and ears of private citizens. As we look through the records of homegrown violent extremists going back 20 years in the United States, and we've done a lot of research on this, in nearly every case, somebody saw something. Somebody saw a change in behavior, somebody saw it acting out at a religious institution, somebody saw something that seemed weird. And then people did what normal people do. They wrote an innocent narrative over the top of that. Right? All of us do that as human beings. You see something that seems weird to you, and the hair stands up on the back of your neck, and you write some narrative like, I must have misunderstood, he must just be having a difficult day, I probably didn't hear that right. Our ask of our fellow citizens is, don't do that. When the hair stands up on the back of your neck, listen to that instinct and just tell somebody. Right? A lot of folks worry I'm going to get somebody in trouble. No, you're not. If there's nothing there, you're not going to get anybody in trouble. We investigate in secret for a very good reason. We don't want to smear innocent people. But if you don't say something, we all may regret that you didn't listen to the hair on the back of your neck. So we need the eyes and ears of our fellow citizens to help us with that. Given the complexity of the threats we face, the diversity of the forces overseas, and the explosion of opportunities for homegrown violent extremists, our safety has to be a collective effort. Law enforcement at all levels and our private citizen colleagues. Now, a word about something that is worrying me a great deal, and that I know Commissioner Bratton and District Attorney Cy Vance have spoken about recently as well, and this is this phenomenon called going dark. Let me just say a word about that and why it's worrying us so much. We believe that a combination of outdated laws and rapidly changing technology is putting us in law enforcement in a place where it's increasingly hard for us to gather the evidence with lawful authority that we need to prosecute and convict wrongdoers across the spectrum of the things we're responsible for. You may have read some of the things I've said about this, so I'm not going to repeat them for you. But I think that we are in a place where I don't want to tell people what to do, but I want to try to foster a national conversation about this. because our world is changing in law enforcement in ways that I don't think most folks realize. And before we get to a place where there's no going back, I think we need to have a conversation about it. Over the last few years, there has been a rapid acceleration in the challenges we face in collecting with court authority real-time communications, so-called data in motion, a problem that is simply amplified by our challenges with accessing, with lawful authority, encrypted data that sits on a device, so-called data at rest. In the past, electronic surveillance was fairly straightforward, right? We'd identify a target, we'd go to a judge, make a showing of probable cause, we'd get authority to intercept the communication. The bad guy had a phone, we got up on that phone for a limited period of time under the supervision of the court, we collected evidence, and we proceeded with our case. Today, the world is enormously more complicated than that. There are countless providers using countless networks, devices, apps, and ways of communicating. We are facing a situation where we're all using lots of different devices, lots of different networks, lots of different apps, and so are the bad guys, to track their victims and to cover up their crimes. A criminal's in his car today. If he switches from cell to Wi-Fi, we may be out of luck. If he goes from one app to another, or goes from cellular voice to messaging, we may lose him. And this was something that always blinked in my peripheral vision up until the time I left government in 2005. But coming back, it began to blink in my near-field vision. And then with the announcement by Apple and Google, it began to blink directly in front of me that we are facing a slide in our culture, in our law enforcement, that we ought to talk about. The announcement by Google and Apple, I don't need to remind you of, but it's that their devices will encrypt by default, meaning that they themselves, even when served with a court order, would not be able to unlock a device to reveal the photos, documents, or email that may be stored within those devices. Our whole world is online, right? All of us, all the time, in one way or another, our entire life, our social lives, our work lives, reside online and on these devices. And that's a great thing. But it also means that that's where the bad guys are. Right? That's where evidence of homicides is, child abuse, domestic violence, terrorism. It is often sitting, the information we need to put bad guys away, on cell phones, smartphones, tablets, or laptops. And today we're seeing more and more cases where we simply can't get to significant evidence that sits there, even with an order from a judge. So, I believe that this going dark phenomenon, both the challenge we have in executing court orders for real time and for stored data, poses a real risk that we in law enforcement are going to miss out on predators, we're going to miss out on violent criminals, we're going to miss out on fraudsters, and most worrisome for purposes of this conference, we're going to miss out on people who are using social media, for example, to plan and plot terrorist acts. This worries me as a citizen and as a law enforcement officer. I am a big believer in the rule of law, but I believe that means that there should be no one in the United States above the law. I also think it means there should be no places in the United States that are beyond the law. I believe very much that we in law enforcement should and need to follow the letter of the law to get access to someone's closet, and the letter of the law to get access to someone's smartphone. But the notion that the marketplace would create a closet that can't ever, ever, ever be opened, or a smartphone device that can't ever be opened, even with a properly obtained court order, is one that doesn't make any sense to me. And so, I'm a believer that people should be skeptical of government power, and I believe the founders of this country were. You can't trust people in power. I always say to people, look, I think I'm an okay person. You should not trust me. Right? You should want to know, how is the design of the founders working in this guy's life? Right? The founders divided power among three branches to set interest against interest. So how's that working? How are they overseen? How are the other branches involved? How are they constrained? How are they restrained? How are the checks and balances working? Right? Our founders wrote this genius document that they themselves concluded wasn't good enough, so they wrote a Bill of Rights. Right? A critical phrase in that Bill of Rights says that the papers and effects of the people, right, need to be secure from unreasonable search and seizure. The way I see it, and reasonable people can see it differently, but the way I see it is that the way we conduct surveillance under court authority to intercept real-time communications, or the way in which we go to court to get warrants to intercept, to take off a device, stored data, is an example of the government acting the way the founders designed it. Right? Pursuant to law, passed by Congress, overseen by the courts, the executive executes. I do not want some sneaky backdoor. I do not want some side door. I want us as a people to find some way with transparency and regularity and discipline for us to be able to access the information we need to be able to do our work. One of the reasons I think it's so important to talk about is I think the post-Snowden wind has blown us to a place where that skepticism I think is so important has become unreasoning cynicism in a lot of places. I think that has blown us to a place where fear and mistrust of law enforcement is getting in the way of a reasoned conversation about what we do, why we do it, and why it matters. I think it's time to have an open and honest debate about liberty and security. And let me say a word about the way in which we often talk about that. We often use a framework when we talk about liberty and security that I struggle with, where we talk about how much liberty are you willing to give up to get how much security. I actually think that that balance, that trade-off framework is a mistake. I think we are at our best when we are offering security that enhances liberty. That is the absolute best situation for all of us. The example I use is think back over the work that's been done here in this great city in the memory of a lot of the people in this audience. Think about the city parks that were not available to old people or young people or anybody because gangbangers and drug dealers and criminals were occupying those parks. When NYPD stationed officers in those communities, in those parks, both security and liberty were enhanced because the people of this great city could enjoy the community without fear of being attacked. Those are the kind of solutions I'm looking for. The people of the FBI are sworn to protect both security and liberty and have to care deeply about doing both consistent with the rule of law. So my goal is to try and start a national conversation, not to boss people around and tell them what we ought to be doing, but to say, look, we're moving to a place where people will come to those of us in law enforcement, right? Come to Commissioner Bratton, come to Cy Vance and say, what do you mean you can't? What do you mean you can't get access to the cell phone of a missing girl to see who she was texting with or where the picture? What do you mean you can't? Before we get to that day, we need to have a conversation about what do we gain, what do we lose, how do we think about where we're ending up. These are very tough issues. I am in a very tough business, as are my colleagues. There's a risk that folks will say, they're a bunch of scaremongers. I hope we're not seen that way. I hope people take the time to understand what we do and the nature of our work and how we want to do it so that we can have a conversation about what society gains and loses by these trends. It matters too much to let it drift to a place where we have those what do you mean you can't encounters. So, in conclusion, there's no doubt that the world has changed significantly since I was last able to serve in government with the changing threat in those two ways that I talked about, the metastasis and the proliferation of homegrown violent extremists. I think the answer to those is simply that we all talk about it and work together, especially federal, state, and local partners. I hope very much that this conversation can take place at a forum like this so that we all get smarter as a result, those of us in government and those of us outside government, because we care about the same things. We care about protecting this city, this country, and innocent people from horrific acts of violence. And I thank you for listening to me and look forward to our conversation. Thank you. Sir. You got to wait for a mic, I think.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to have you here. And thanks, Fordham, for doing this. Steve Shapiro from Business Executives for National Security. Over the years, when looking at the FBI as an intelligence versus a law enforcement agency, the two roles that you highlighted for the Bureau, sometimes there are suggestions that the Bureau is culturally ingrained to be a law enforcement agency, and it's really a struggle to become the intelligence agency that we know it needs to be. there have been great strides under Mueller and terrific new strides under you. And I wonder if you could comment on one of them that I've recently observed, and that's the removal of the intelligence division from the national security branch and setting it up as its own entity. I think that's an extraordinary move, and I wonder if you could just explain that and what you expect to get from it as a result. Thank you.
Sure, I'd be happy to. There's no doubt that the transformation that Bob Mueller began took a lot of work, but as you said, has made a tremendous amount of progress. One of the things I saw when I came is that the intelligence branch was underneath the national security branch. And as I said during my remarks, my thinking was, if I'm going to drive that kind of thoughtfulness, and really at bottom, that's what I'm talking about here, which is an exercise in being thoughtful about what do we need to work on, what do we need to know, who needs to know what we know. That's a way of approaching our work that ought to be part of everything we do. And so having the intelligence division under National Security Branch, I thought got in the way of driving those habits of mind into our criminal work, into our cyber work, into everything that we do. And so I simply, no new bureaucracy. I just took the leader of the Director of Intelligence, moved it out, so he was one of my 6 branch chiefs. And the other reason is so I could stare at him every morning, the poor guy, and say, how's it going? Because I think of the relationship between, a core to this transformation is the relationship between our special agents and our intelligence analysts. And I think of that as a marriage, and so I want to know every morning, so how's the marriage? How's it going? Are we working together in a good way? Because to me, I don't want to talk too long, but the essence of this is, in the special agents of the FBI, we've always had a great gift, which is that ability to talk to other people and get stuff, learn stuff. My vision of the intelligence transformation is simply wrapping that gift, pick your own food, let's use a bagel, because I love bagels, in a bagel of talent that helps those special agents, equips them to think, so what should we know? How do I find it out? Who needs to know what we found out? And together, those two make us much, much better than we were 15 years ago. So I'm moving the separate branch to try and drive that kind of approach throughout the entire organization.
So just quickly, they'll be doing criminal as well as CT and WMD intel?
Yeah, we have, yes is the answer. I want intelligence analysts embedded in everything that we do. My international operations, right, I've got 84 foreign offices. I want intelligence analysts working with our foreign offices, again, to drive that same intellectual discipline. What do we know? What do we need to know? Who needs to know what you found out within this organization and elsewhere? I want that part of everything the FBI does. To me, it's not about new authorities, right? It's about taking the work we're already doing and being more thoughtful about it. Yes, sir. Then I'll go to this.
Speaking of conversations, what are your conversations with the makers of these smartphones, tight smartphones? What are they saying to you?
I don't want to say. We are having conversations with them, but let me take it because I don't want to chill any private conversations we have. But
one-way conversation.
Say again.
That's only a one-way conversation.
No, between you and me, it's a one-way.
Yeah.
But we do sit down and talk to them, and we're having conversations with them. But I don't want to talk about those publicly because I don't want to chill those. But I can say this. I'm not trying to pick on them as people. I understand where they're coming from, right? I was the general counsel of 2 different companies before coming back to government. I know their lawful duty, right, to maximize shareholder value. I believe they are in good faith trying to respond to what they perceive to be a market demand. It's not their job, except as citizens, I know they care about this, but it's not their day job to worry about the collateral effects on security and law enforcement. That's my job, to speak to that, to make sure that those 2 interests, that market demand that they're responding to, and the national security and law enforcement concerns we have, get heard together in the public square. Janine.
It's good to have you back in New York, Mr. Director. You recently talked about lone wolves, preferring to call them lone rats. And you said that unless their passport is revoked as citizens, they're entitled to come back into the country and live here, but that you would monitor them. There are 3 things that come to mind. Number 1, treason, and I know it's very difficult to prove. Number 2, seditious conspiracy, which is a little easier, and apparently we've charged some of the guys working with Al-Qaeda with that. And number, whatever it is, in terms of revoking their passports, why is there not legislation that we can get passed to do that? And finally, how many FBI agents does it take to track someone 24/7 You say there are 12 of them, although there could be more. And what burden is that creating for you?
Yeah, thanks, Jeanine. It's good to see you too. I think I either garbled it or the way it came across. I think that was a 60 Minutes interview. Folks misunderstood what I said. Someone with a valid U.S. passport can return to the United States. What I meant to say is we track them very carefully if they're coming back to the United States. If I have evidence that you have fought with any of these foreign terrorist organizations, you will be locked up. We will track you till you land here, then we will lock you up. As you said, there's a variety of, frankly, much easier statutes to use to lock somebody up, if I can prove it. A material support to a terrorist organization is one. So that's fairly easy. I didn't mean, and I was surprised people thought I meant this, that we will simply follow bad people around the country on whom we have sufficient evidence to prosecute for fighting with ISIL. No. So that's, put that one to rest. It is, so I guess I don't need to answer the rest of it. Yeah. And folks just misunderstood what I meant. When someone said to me, I said, people really think I'm an idiot? Right? Oh, we're just going to follow all these people around the country. No. If I have evidence to prosecute you for fighting with a terrorist group and you have a valid passport, when you land at JFK, you will be at the MCC before the sun goes down. Yeah, Deborah.
Hi, Deborah Farrick from CNN. The question I have is for many of us in this room who lived through 9/11, you look at that kind of a terror plot, that kind of an attack, which was sort of based out of Al-Qaeda Central, and then you look at something like the homegrown violent extremist threat, the sort of lone wolves that are out there sort of planning and plotting. How do you balance the FBI agents' work trying to uncover the next 9/11 compared with the work they're doing trying to uncover these sort of lone wolves who act independently, who usually don't have ties to anybody? How do you balance the two needs of both of those, which are equally serious, but the impacts may be a little bit different?
Yeah, I don't so thank you for the question. I don't think of them as a balance. Right? We're doing both, and they both pose threats to the people of the United States in different ways. But we do both, and I believe I have the resources to do both. I mean, sequestration, when that lifted, we started hiring again. I'll have 37,000 folks just of my own, but then I have 104 JTTFs, including the original JTTF here in Manhattan, in New York, where we have partners with a tremendous number of state and local law enforcement, and so we're all working on both of those threats. I don't see them as a balanced one, where I don't trade it off. I'll go here.
Bruce Levinson, the Center for Regulatory Effectiveness. Terrorists require money. It's the fuel. Can you discuss how tobacco trafficking helps fund terrorism?
I guess I can't in an intelligent way. I mean, I know enough to be dangerous that has been a part of a number of our terrorism organizations. I actually don't see it as a central feature of the challenge posed by the progeny of Al-Qaeda. ISIL, AQAP, AQIM, and Nusra. I don't see it that way. I'm going to call on Bart Gilman. You ask me some tricky technology question? All right.
Actually, a pretty simple analogy question. Two things on this device encryption business, among lots of other things you could talk about. One is, how is this different from saying that you shouldn't be able to buy a lock without telling the lock company what combination you're sending, or you can't buy a shovel without telling the manufacturer where you're digging a hole? Why is it that you should demand perfect knowledge of what people do with their devices? And do you see any possibility in your respect for civil liberties that inefficiency in terms of law enforcement, intelligence gathering, at some level it is a feature, not a bug, that just as you're willing to have some people who are guilty go free in a trial rather than convict an innocent person, that you don't necessarily want a world in which you can track thousands of people's locations with one person when it used to be you'd need 12 to follow one?
You know, that's a reasonable question, and that's, let me take your second part first. I think that's actually, Bart, at the heart of the conversation we need to have, is given the way we're going, will it go beyond mere inefficiency to a sort of total darkness on the law enforcement front? I mean, it used to be when you'd execute a search warrant in a drug case, you'd actually find paper, right? Because the knuckleheads will have written, Shorty got this much, and they wrote it in one of those black tablets. And it's increasingly the case there's no paper at all. It's tablets, thumb drives, laptops. And so I can envision a future where that information is utterly inaccessible to us. And so is that mere inefficiency? Maybe in the view of some, my view is that it would be maybe the mother of all inefficiencies. And so I would weigh it in ways that are obvious from what I've said. With respect to the first part of the question, there's no, maybe I'm misunderstanding the question, but there's no lock, there's no safe in the world that can't be opened, right? And so to me, what's different about this is that we're talking about devices that, not just theoretically, that can't possibly be opened. And before we got to selling those kinds of locks or those kinds of safes, that's the conversation I think we need to have. All the way in the back, sir. No, come on. Oops, I think I was pointing at the guy literally all the way in the back. Sorry. All right, and then we'll go to the gentleman nearly in the back.
Thanks very much. ABC News, Ian McGrady. Do you think the FBI needs more legal authorities to disrupt an ISIL fighter or sympathizer here in the United States, or are current authorities enough to address the threat in the fullest way possible?
I think the current authorities are sufficient. Yeah, I don't think I need new legal tools. Yes, sir.
Bob Windrum from NBC News and fellow of the center. Last week, John Adams, who I think is your deputy for counterterrorism, also spoke in Orlando, and one of the things he noted was that there were 50 Americans who had traveled to Somalia to fight with al-Shabaab. What happened to those people, and why haven't they become a threat now, almost 10 years after they traveled there?
Well, I guess I don't know the particular number. There were quite a few who traveled to Somalia, especially in the 2007, 2008 period. So what happened to them? I mean, they're in three buckets: dead, in jail, or still out there, and we're still keeping an eye on them. I mean, we view them very much as a threat and concern. Different, though, because the al-Shabaab threat was people going over there and largely staying in the Horn of Africa. The ISIL threat is both there and focused on the West and the United States. So I see it as different, but no, we haven't taken our eye off of those folks. Yes.
Thank you, Director Comey. Great to see you again. James Meek with ABC News. Sir, in early 2011, Matt Olson of the NCTC testified before the House.
He was a bum. We got rid of him. No, he's sitting right here. I'm just kidding. Just kidding.
He had a...
I'll fix that, Matt. They'll edit that out. Yeah.
One of the high points of that career, he had a sort of seminal moment when he told the House Homeland Security Committee that the weight of the threat had shifted from core al-Qaeda, bin Laden in Pakistan, to AQAP in Yemen. That core al-Qaeda was still a threat, but AQAP and its bomb maker and so forth, Alaki at that time was still alive, was perhaps a greater threat. Do you see the weight of the threat now, as you see it metastasizing, shifting to Syria in particular, with JN, Khorasanis, the ISIL? Core al-Qaeda is still, I'm sure you consider them a great threat. AQAP is still a threat. They're obviously working together quite a lot, but do you see the weight of the threat shifting now towards Syria, given what we're seeing with ISIL in particular? Has that occurred, or do you see it in the near future?
The weight shifting throws me a little bit. I suppose so. And let me just explain why I'm saying that, and maybe you can poke back at it. I think Matt was absolutely right, because he was the best NCTC director we ever had. In 2011, that was absolutely the case. And then we've seen a change, not in kind, but in degree. Right? That is, since 2011, the safe haven offered in Syria has allowed Nusra and the other groups you mentioned to flourish, ISIL. And so AQAP remains a serious concern of ours, Added to that list have been the other groups that you mentioned: ISIL, Nusra, Khorasan. So it's more that AQAP remains a serious threat, and we've added, I guess is the way I'd say it. Yes, ma'am. Did I recover from that one, Matt? Okay, good.
Thank you. First, I want to say thank you for being here. It's an honor to hear you. In regards to terrorist propaganda, do you ever get concerned that the amount of media, I guess US media coverage on terrorist attacks such as the one in Canada is inadvertently kind of contributing to the terrorist propaganda that attracts people to whichever terrorist organizations call?
I don't, because I think any media coverage at all, even a small amount, that a group like ISIL thinks is in their interest, they're going to clip it and cut it and push it out. And so it'll go like a virus through social media. So I really don't see it as an issue. Over here, front row. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Ahmed Fati, A-H-M-E-D-F-A-T-H-I. I'm a UN Press Corps member. With regard to homegrown terrorism, and especially in the tri-state area where there is abundance of American citizens who have Middle Eastern and Islamic background, according to the current situation, as we observe it on the ground, there is a shift from recruiting inside New York City due to the work that the NYPD is been carrying out after September 11, and moving across the Hudson to New Jersey, in counties, in Jersey City, in Bergen, etc., and using these mosques platforms to politicize everything is happening, and there is actually several correlations between Friday sermons and terrorist attacks in the Egyptian-Israeli borders in the Sinai. How does the FBI see balancing liberties and security? The best way to bring those centers of early recruitment, soft recruitment, into control and into the focus of law enforcement. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you for your question. First, I actually don't see religious institutions as a central feature of recruitment in the United States. I see it increasingly, as I said earlier, as an online phenomenon without center, which makes it very difficult for us. Because, to get to the second part of your question, I think we have always worked to establish productive relationships with communities of all sorts, including communities of faith, centers of Islamic faith, so that the good people in those communities will tell us when they see someone acting in a weird way or acting out. But again, I really do see it increasingly. This is a step change that all of us in law enforcement are facing in national security, is the movement to decentralized online peer-to-peer recruiting. Removes the need for someone to go to a physical center to meet other people to be recruited. And so that's why I said in my first comment, I don't see religious institutions as a center of recruiting. We want to continue to have good relationships with them, but I don't see that. Yes, ma'am.
Hello, my name is Doris Schechter, and I have a question. Do you find a thread running psychologically through all of these people that are so eager to join these terrorist groups?
That's a great question. It's something we spend a lot of time thinking about, because the challenge, we talked about travelers, the challenge of the traveler phenomenon is there's no typical profile. We're talking about people 18 to 63, I think is my oldest traveler, and white people, black people, South Asian heritage, Asian heritage. We see people from all walks of life. As best we've been able to determine it, the common feature is they're troubled souls who are seeking some sort of meaning in their life. And there are three ingredients. The first is they come into contact with the propaganda of these groups, increasingly ISIL, because they're so slick at it. Second, they come into contact with someone, typically online, who offers them a view of their faith that points them in the direction of engaging in violent conduct to find meaning. And third, they meet some others, 2 or 3 like-minded people, again, typically online, who are engaging in this misguided mission themselves. And those three ingredients work together on the troubled mind to lure them into thinking that's where I will find some sort of meaning in my life. But finding a typical person, physical being in which that troubled mind sits is actually something that has eluded us. There is not a typical physical vessel that's carrying that troubled mind. I'll go here, ma'am.
I'm Dina Temple-Raston with National Public Radio. I wanted to ask you a little bit about people who maybe aren't the hard cases. For example, the 3 young schoolgirls who left from Denver. Are there tools that you have or that you're developing that are short of arrest? So some of these people who may go naively thinking they're joining some sort of Muslim utopia have a way to come back and maybe provide important intelligence that you need?
Yes, we're trying. We're focused on that. It's not something I want to talk about much in a public forum. Enormously difficult for reasons that are obvious. Right? We're not in the business of messaging. Right? In part, we count on people in the media to tell the truth about what savages these people are. And this isn't some utopian caliphate, that it's a place of savagery and enslavement. But it is very difficult. But it's something we're focused on. I'm probably going to leave it right there. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Mr. Director, Adam Perlmutter, you...
Wait for the mic. He's going to...
You instituted a reform a while back on videotaping, and it seems to be one of those places where I think you see both security and liberty being able to advance internally within the FBI. My question is, can you give us some sense of what other things? First of all, how's that going in implementation, and can you give us some sense of other ways that you would see advancing security and liberty to move that discussion along that you say that we have to have as a country?
Yeah, it's a good question. What he was referring to was we are now video recording all custodial interrogations that the FBI does, and it's going very well. I mean, I agree with you. I happen to think it's something that is a win-win. I think it's good for my folks. It's good for the justice system. Unfortunately for prosecutors, I think it'll lead to fewer trials. But and for defense lawyers, lead for fewer trials. I'm sorry. No one will get the deck on their house. But there are a number of other things, but I'm not ready to talk about them. We're constantly looking for ways, and I welcome feedback, things that we can do differently to achieve both of those goals. Yeah, go all the way to the back. And I'll come over here. I forgot that section.
Hi, thanks for being here. I have a question. What are you doing to challenge some of the propaganda that's out there in an overwhelming way? Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think I was, in response to your earlier question, I alluded to it. That's not something that we do. I wouldn't want the FBI ever to be in the communicating, trying to shape hearts and minds business. I think that's both confusing and challenging given the wonderful rule of law that we adhere to here. So the answer is not much, except trying to make sure that we're establishing relationships, as I alluded to earlier. I think it's hard to hate up close, and I think the more you know us, you realize we're people, so we're flawed in all kinds of ways, but that we are trying to do the right thing in the right way. So I'm trying to make sure I continue to encourage my folks in all of our field offices, get out and get people in the community to know you, so that if they see something that's making the hair on the back of their neck stand up, they'll say something, knowing that we're not bad people, we want to do the right thing, but we are not about the business of trying to shape counter messaging in the FBI. It's not our thing. I'll go all the way to the back, sir. Yep. Oh, and then I'll come over here.
Listening to the Fordham Law IT department. I was before the gentleman asked the question about the propaganda. I want to know, is cybersecurity, offensive cybersecurity efforts are acceptable in order to shut down websites or servers that give propaganda to terrorism?
Acceptable by activity by the FBI? Yeah, that's not something we do. Yeah. I'll take one more question. There's a gentleman in the back there.
Director T.Y. Chang from Fox 5. What would be required to access that cell phone of the missing 16-year-old in terms of technology and the law? And what are you doing? What are you approaching? What is the FBI doing to try to get to that point?
Well,
what would be required? I know you're not there
right.
yet, but what would be required and what are you aiming for?
Well, if it was, we would need a search warrant, but we would also need, if it was encrypted by default, we'd be, under the current design, let's say it was an iPhone, we'd be out of luck. I mean, we would not be able to break into the device. So we could have all the search warrants in the world we want.
So
but
from a technological point of view, there's nothing that can be done in the future to change that?
Oh, sure, yeah. I mean, but I thought you were asking about today and the current. I imagine there are any number of ways that could be done. I don't think I'm smart enough to know. I'm not smart enough to envision exactly what the solution would be. But my vision of it is there has to be some solution that would allow us with lawful authority to be able to have the company unlock the device. And that's the conversation I want to have. I have to run, so thank you all. Thanks for doing the conference.